good to have you with us as we head on down the road. Larry Jacobs is going to join us right now. Larry is University of Minnesota professor. 16 books he's published. He is the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. In other words, he knows what he's talking about. So let's get him on. Larry, good to have you coming down the road with us.
Always good to be with you, Joel. Thank you.
Obviously a big day yesterday. We saw what happened in Virginia. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet in New Jersey. To me, as a Democrat, I'm one of the few left here in North Dakota, it wasn't a good day to be a Democrat, Larry.
Well, I could see that. And, you look around the country and there were other setbacks for Democrats. Not a surprise if you've been following this closely. Joe Biden's approval rating has nosedived over the last 6 months. Afghanistan, that didn't help. The fighting among Democrats in Washington and being unable to pass their agenda, that certainly didn't help. And then some poor campaigning.
I have to ask you this, because you mentioned poor campaigning, and we're going to get back to the other stuff in a little bit. But, I'm a Democrat from the upper Midwest. I don't use my pronouns correctly. It's who I am. Do Democrats really, have we gotten to a place, when I say we, I mean me and my family, have we gotten to a place where everything has to be so correct? That it's all about the letters behind your name, and that it's like if you disagree with them, you really can't talk to them because they really don't grasp it. I mean, have Democrats gotten a little too snooty?
Well, I thought one of the most interesting findings from yesterday is that this educational divide is strengthening. In other words, so-called better educated folks are breaking very strongly for Democrats. And this includes folks that, a decade or so ago would vote for Republicans, folks in the suburbs, suburban women who are better educated. They're tending to break for Democrats. The less well-educated folks with maybe just a little bit of college or just high school, they're breaking decidedly for Republicans. That's what happened in Virginia overwhelmingly, and it's also happened in New Jersey. So yes, I think what we're seeing is kind of this cultural divide that in some ways is based on a sense, I know best. Here's the right answer, the rest of you fall in line. There is another agenda that the Democrats could have been talking about. All this work they've been doing in Washington, it is about bread and butter. It's about, providing opportunity for folks who are ready to work, folks who want to go to work but have kids, folks who'd like to work but they're ill or they can't afford their drugs. I mean, all these things that are wrapped, plus lots of job creation. That agenda, has been snuffed out by the Democrats. Republicans were delighted to run on, school board and critical race theory and mandates from the federal government on COVID. All that plays to their hand, and the Democrats did nothing really to challenge that agenda.
Well, before we go forward, I still want to go backwards a little bit, Larry, because when I grew up, the legislative district that I represented for 14 years built Bobcats, skid steers. And I had union workers, and those union workers supported me. They did. I walked in line with them when they went out on strike. I connected with them. And quite frankly, I was proud to be a union worker. Something's happened along the way to where my union worker buddies they're no longer voting Democrat. They're voting for, they think I'm going to take their guns away. They think I don't care about God. They don't look at the blue collar issues, wages, health care. And I've always wondered a little bit, Larry, if it isn't deserving by the Democrat side because of what you just explained, that we could have lost really what our focus was and where our attention should have been. And it also could be a little bit of this, whether or not we've won what they needed to win, and they could forget about it and take it for granted. For example, I worked hard on workers' comp. Workers' comp got fixed. Well, they don't need me anymore to work on workers' comp. I worked hard on making sure that they had less of a deductible on their health care. They don't need me to do that anymore. Do you see what I'm getting at, Larry?
I do, but I do think there's lots that the working man and woman is struggling with. A lot of folks were out of work because of COVID. Even now, a lot of folks are scared to go back to work, or they're at home with their kids and they can't afford childcare. Healthcare costs are soaring. Democrats promised to do something about it, and in all those areas, it's a big zero. And so I think there is a kind of a sense of, what have you done? You ran on these promises. Biden got a record number of votes, and there's really not much to show for it. I do think there's a lot of what you're saying that's true. I think clearly the Democrats have lost their working class base. A lot of the folks in Congress don't have a working class background. A lot of folks in the state legislatures are lawyers rather than union members. And that makes a big difference because of the priorities. Am I going to make the priority of, the environment the top thing? Or is there a trade-off in which we say, look, we need to make sure people have jobs. And if they can't put food on the table, then the environment is not going to be that important to them.
So how big of a factor did COVID play into yesterday? Give me your take, because I know you mentioned, mandates a vaccine, mandates of masks in school. How big of a factor do you believe that COVID played in that race, or in those races?
I think the sense of the federal government being overbearing was a huge issue for Republicans. And what we saw is around the country that Republicans turned out in greater numbers than the Democrats, and that the Democratic turnout in just a year ago was down considerably. And that really is a story, for instance, in Virginia. If Democrats had turned out as they had, just a year ago, then we would have seen, I think, a very different outcome.
Well, when you take a look at it, the one race that to me was the most interesting was New Jersey. And of course, that's not all settled out yet. There's going to be recall and everything else that comes along with it. But everybody talks about how Virginia has turned blue. Well, okay, the Democrats have been on a good run in Virginia, but you never would have convinced me that it was just this solid dark blue state. New Jersey is. You look at the separation between Biden and Trump in New Jersey, and to see New Jersey be as close as what it is, that's what made me wonder about the role of COVID, because the governor of New Jersey has been just overwhelming when it comes to what to do in answering this COVID crisis. Murphy's been very aggressive, and I wonder if that isn't why he's sitting there wondering if, in fact, he did win this election.
Yeah, and I think, clearly, again, the over-motivation of Republicans compared to Democrats mattered a lot. COVID was like supercharging. The other part is COVID has not stopped dogging our economy. And there are a lot of folks who are being hit either by high inflation or they're not getting the jobs they want at the wages they want. Our economy is being throttled by the supply chain issues. There's a lot of stuff going on here. And so if the Democrats have been able to come in and really get a handle on COVID, the economy comes soaring back, and it was, smiles all around, I think would be a different story. Right now, the economic picture is very mixed, and it's really hurting a lot of people. That became, I think, the background to the story, where a lot of Democratic voters sat it out. They didn't see the big payoff. They felt like they were really had voted for Biden and the Democrats, and they hadn't delivered.
Yeah. If you were in a room and the topic around that coffee table became the only reason the Democrats lost was because of Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema, and they said to you, Larry, you've written over 16 books on subjects like this. You understand it, you teach it. The state of Minnesota, through the University of Minnesota, says you're so doggone good at it. We want you here. What's your answer to that? What are you going to say to the people around that coffee table if they tell you that it's all Joe Manchin's fault.
You know what? They would not be having that conversation if Manchin had not been able to be elected in West Virginia, where Donald Trump won by, huge double-digit margins. He is a conservative Democrat, and there's no changing that. In old days, you might describe him as kind of an Eisenhower Republican. And that's the reality. If you look at the Republicans who, after the 2016 election, they had, the White House with Trump, and they had control of Congress, but they too had splits among their members. You'll remember that John McCain stood up and shot down repeal of the Affordable Care Act because McCain was not as conservative and thought the process was really out of whack. So this idea that, everyone falls in line, it's not realistic. And it's certainly not realistic for these more conservative states that Democrats are lucky to win.
Yeah. In the case of Manchin, I've met Joe. I've had the good fortune of getting to know him a little bit. And I have to tell you, what you get. I mean, exactly what you get, and you're spot on. There's nobody that on the Democratic side says I'm the committee chair, or even gets to wear a cutoff sleeve denim jacket up in front of the Senate if it isn't for Joe Manchin. And Donald Trump won his state by 35 points. 35 points. And so, but I do have to ask you, because there's a lot of speculation out there today that Joe Manchin is doing this because he's running for president. And I don't think I've ever heard anything I disagreed with more, but I'm curious what you think about that.
I think people don't frankly understand politics, who don't appreciate that the parties are kind of an umbrella. And while the parties have clearly, at each other's throats, the D's and the R's, within each party, there are very significant divisions, more so in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. You have AOC, who's a socialist, and then you have Joe Manchin, who's kind of a Rockefeller Democrat. And that's a huge divide. They're not going to all agree, and that is just, I think, the reality. I do think there's an area where they can agree, and my hunch is in the next month, there will be, really a historic piece of legislation that are passed that are going to provide needed support for our infrastructure so we can compete with China. It's going to provide needed support for working families and also for, beginning to tackle the climate change. So it's going to happen, but it was never going to be a lockstep. And those who thought it was really don't understand the nature of American politics and the genuine differences of opinion. Joe Manchin has been saying the same thing, and I'm sure you know this. He's been saying the same thing for years. This isn't like he's grandstanding. He's always talked about fiscal responsibility. He's always wanted stuff scored. And he's been, often a no vote on things he thought were too much spending.
Go to Minneapolis a lot. It's 3 hours away from where I live in North Dakota. You just hop on the road and go. And so, there was a lot of talk about this whole initiative to, it could be put a lot of ways, but the truth is the nation was looking at it as was described, defunding the police. Did you see that going down as overwhelmingly as what it did?
I did think it was going to go down. The margin was larger than I thought. The way I would put this is Minneapolis dodged a bullet last night in terms of this ballot initiative. The George Floyd killing has left a deep scar, and I think it's universally felt. And the question is, can the Minneapolis Police turn the page and really be a more disciplined force in a lot of different ways, including the way they treat Black people? And I think this amendment didn't capture that spirit. I think it was really driven by a bunch of activists who were very sectarian, who were picking fights with people who should have been allies. And you had 75% of Black residents in Minneapolis opposed to reducing the number of police. So, this was just, I think, horrible campaigning by a group of ultra progressives, and they hurt their own cause. But I think it would be a big mistake to read this as kind of part of the shift in the more conservative direction. last night that we saw in Virginia and elsewhere. Because at the same time that the public safety initiative went down, Minneapolis approved a quite progressive rent stabilization ballot initiative. And there were new city council members elected who did support the public safety initiative, but are seen as more pragmatic and willing to work with others.
Well, where's Minneapolis when it comes to the police force itself? Does anybody want to work for the Minneapolis police force? Have you lost policemen and women? I mean, where do you sit in terms of, the future of the police force?
I grew up in a working class town back in New York. It's a railroad town. And, the folks who worked in the force were folks I played football with and grew up with. And they always saw themselves as part of the community. And that's the way it is, a lot of the upper Midwest. The police and our neighbors are often the same people. Now, that does not happen in Minneapolis and Twin Cities. You've got this animosity that now exists between the police force and a lot of the citizens, particularly if you're in a community of color. That has made this a really scary place for a lot of police. We've seen kind of a record number of folks taking sick leaves or retiring. The number of police officers in Minneapolis is considerably lower than where the chief would like it. So yeah, there's a real crisis, I think, in the police force.
I want to talk about the messaging, though. I don't think there ever could have been a worse political message than defund the police. I've been in politics all my adult life, and I don't think I've ever heard a campaign slogan that would have been worse. And then you look at where the Democrats were in Virginia and the battle that they were fighting there, where somebody was talking to them about critical race theory, and the Democratic messaging was so bad that they couldn't get across what critical race theory was. And they didn't challenge the people who criticized them on critical race theory to tell them what it was. I mean, are the Democrats, are the progressives just that bad at messaging?
I think what's happened is there's a group of, I describe them as ultra progressives, folks like AOC and Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. And they're really coming from, socialist or pretty far left position. They are not interested in winning elections outside of their neighborhoods. And so the messaging they have is a messaging that they use in their very safe districts. Defund the police was, after the damage became clear, was rejected by some of the city council members. But the idea lived on. In fact, if you look at the ballot language that was fought over, it says police, and this is a quote, police, comma, if necessary. Close quote. And that was, that was picked up by everybody. It's, why are you doing that? Why are you making this a referendum on police or not at a time when violent, gun use in Minneapolis is at a record level? It is just mind-boggling. But again, I think it's this most sectarian, insular view of this is what our community, this is what we believe, and, get on board. And politics doesn't work like that. You need to be able to rally people who may disagree with you, who may be nervous about some things, who need to be, you need to walk toward them and engage them in a conversation. That has not been happening with lots of Democrats, and certainly not in Minneapolis.
So how does this all affect the midterm? Because, all indications right now, first off, historically, it's brutal for the party in power. But how does this affect it? Because as you pointed out earlier in the show, you've got a president whose agenda has not yet passed. If it passes, does it get better? Obviously, both of us know the answer if it doesn't pass. But where do you see us heading in the midterm?
Well, I think the agenda in Washington will pass, because I think this was a wake-up call. I guess it was needed for Democrats. I think they'll pass. It'll be, again, a historic set of bills that will be passed. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think one place to look is Joe Biden's approval rating. He's in Donald Trump territory right now. And Donald Trump did terribly in the midterm elections in 2018. And Democrats will do horribly. That's the clear message. There's no doubt about it. The mayhem that we saw around the country for Democrats will continue. And the Republicans could get substantial majorities in the United States House and the United States Senate. So they've got to, get on a program of passing what they promised. Joe Biden needs to become much more effective as a president, communicating what he's doing and why Americans should support it. And then he needs a break. The economy needs to pick up. The supply chain needs to become more normal. COVID needs to go away, or at least become more like the flu. I mean, all these things need to line up. But right now, I would say if you're a Democrat in elected office, start passing around your resumes.
You take a look at all of this, and again, I couldn't agree more. But you look at the approval ratings. You look at how some of that shakes out. How many people in America do you believe know that a deal's been cut so that for senior citizens, they're never going to have to pay more than $2,000 for prescription meds? I go back to messaging. The Democrats made that deal. That's going to be part of what they do, and they haven't even gotten it out to the public yet before some of the biggest elections to tell them. It's like they can't help themselves. They don't get that that's a huge factor with the elderly. That prescription meds and fixing prescription meds is a huge factor, and yet they don't talk about it. The American people don't even know about it. I mean, it's ridiculous.
If you go back 2 weeks ago, that wasn't even in the bill that Joe Biden talked about.
Yeah.
So the cake is still in the oven. It hasn't been baked yet. But I do think on the issue of prescription drugs, if the Democrats pass it and it's close to what's being advertised, then I think you're going to see this massive organization known as AARP get behind it and participate in spreading the word. And then it's up to Democrats to sell what they've done. And I agree with you. They get distracted. You remember the old Bill Clinton line during the 1992 campaign? It's the economy, stupid.
Yep.
Well, 2022 is going to need something like that. Just don't get distracted. Don't let Republicans pull you off into the culture war. Just don't take the bait. Stick to what are you delivering for everyday Americans, particularly those who are struggling.
Larry, thank you. I love getting a chance to visit with you. I appreciate it. I know they can find your books. Is there a place online where they can see the whole body of work?
Amazon.
Okay, there you go. Buy them. There's 16 out there. How can you miss it? So thank you, Larry. Appreciate you coming on.